Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to another session of the Belongg Book Club. So what Belongg does is that it is a social organization that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face discrimination on the basis of their identity. So this could be gender, sexuality, race, caste, ethnicity, religion, disability, the list goes on. The Belongg Book Club and Library in particular has been featuring authors who write on themes of identity, diversity, and inclusion, and hosting these webinars in conversation with them so that we can keep these conversations going even as we are socially distanced. Today we have with us Ruth, and just before I introduce her, I want to say a bit about the format of this webinar. So what we're going to do is Ruth is going to say a little bit about her book and read an excerpt she's picked out for us. I'm going to ask her a couple of questions just to get the discussion going. Meanwhile, all of you should feel free to send in your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. If there's anything else that's not a question, if there's sort of a technical difficulty or something of the sort that you want to alert us to, use the chat feature that is also at the bottom of your screens. But all questions ideally in the Q&A box because that helps us curate them much more easily. And of course, as we go along, Ruth also has a couple of more excerpts that she can read depending on how much time we have. And yeah, I'm looking forward to today's conversation. So now to say a bit about Ruth. Ruth taught at Delhi University for 20 years and is now professor at the University of Montana. She was founding co-editor of Manushi 1978 to 1990. She is the author of several books, including Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriage in India, Gender, Sex and the City, Urdu Rekhti Poetry in India, 1780 to 1870, and Dancing with the Nation, Courtesans in Bombay Cinema. She is the co-editor of Same-Sex Love in India, a literary history, and has translated many works of fiction and poetry from Hindi and Urdu to English, most notably Chocolate, Stories on Male Desire by Pandey Bechan Sharma Ugra. This is her first work of fiction. She divides her time between Missoula and Gurgaon, which is also where I am at the moment. So Ruth, over to you, and looking forward to today's session.
Okay, hi, my name is Ruth Vanita. This is the novel which has just been published by Penguin as an ebook. You can get it on Amazon.in and Amazon.com as an ebook. And it will be released in print in the first week of July, hopefully. Bookstores stay open. It's a novel set in the late 18th century, and it's a love story between a dancer and a poet, both of whom are courtesans. One lives in Banaras and one in Lucknow. And it's a short novel. It's also paints a picture of the society of the time and many different types of relationships and friendships and so on.
Great. So let's begin with an excerpt then.
Okay, this is close to the beginning when the two women, Nafis is the narrator, woman narrator, and when Nafis meets Chapla for the first time. So this is set in a neighboring kota, and there is a session going on to call a jinn, this was a women's practice of the time, to call a jinn or a pari to take possession of a woman who would then answer the questions of all the people who were there. So that's where they meet. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the first chapter. It was at a session for the Red Ferry that we met. Those sessions were not the rage then as they are now, but they did occur from time to time. Some woman who had a question about the future or who was upset because of her sister, her girlfriend, her paramour, or her pesky servants, or among the begums, her mother-in-law or sister-in-law, would decide to consult the jinns and paris, the ones made of light, they called them. After the questions had all been asked and answered more or less satisfactorily by which jinn was it, Mia Shah Daria? Everyone sat around talking, sipping wine. I was awake now, wishing I could get back to the poem I was working on, but reluctant to go out into the darkness from the scented warmth of the room. Matta Napa had outdone herself, reddening it up, hung with crimson draperies lit with scarlet-shaded candles that echoed the sapphire and ruby-tinted Persian carpet. The air itself seemed red, heavy with the scent of rose petals floating in copper bowls. Red wine, beetroot kebabs, red sweets made of carrots and pomegranate heaped on French china. Matta Napa herself was in red satin. Matta Napa's friend, who had been possessed and whose name I forget, seemed to have recovered from her head whirlings and was handing out bits of her half-chewed pan to greedy, perspiring suppliants, their still wet hair draped unpleasingly over their shoulders. Matta Napa surveyed the room triumphantly. A couple of pomegranate seeds popped in my mouth, filling it with an acrid, somewhat gritty sweetness. Oh, Nafis, here's Ketiki Bai's daughter, someone, I don't remember who, said. I looked up. She was half smiling, half laughing in that semi-shy, semi-mischievous way to which I would become addicted. Our eyes met, held, the room fell silent. Stripped bare, I stood on the threshold of birth, gazing into fire. She was in white, all white against the redness. Was her hair open as if freshly washed? Or is memory playing hide and seek with fantasy? Ambeen didn't know you were coming. She's gone to Faizabad. It was a last minute thing, but I'll come again, I'm sure. Still sunlight. Are Nafis, we've been talking about nothing else for at least 2 days. Dulhan Jan's voice, glass crashing into a garden. Where have you been? The others giggled. Nafis Bitia has better things to do. She's busy reading and writing, Matanapa retorted. She takes all your gossip in one ear and lets it out the other. There was a double edge to this reproach. Most of her girls were settled with patrons, unlike me, evidence of my indulgent mother's bad management. If we said anything else, I don't remember what it was. Nor do I remember how I found myself in the silent lane where the band seemed to be playing at one of Martin Saab's parties as I looked at the sky through his big telescope and saw the stars up close. The darkness vibrated as if I'd stared at the sun and then closed my eyes.
Wow, it's very sort of sensual writing. And clearly it's so sensual that it makes the character sort of forget so many details of, what's happening. But do you want to read another excerpt now, or should we do that later?
Whatever you think.
So, I think we can read maybe one more and then save I know there's a third one, right? So save that for later. Yeah.
Okay. So this is when they are getting to know each other. Chapla has moved temporarily to Lucknow and she's living in the next door kota, and they keep climbing over the roof and coming to each other, which is all what everybody does, and coming to each other's rooms. So here, let me try something different with your hair. She came up behind me and began to re-braid it. Any number of girls had braided my hair and I theirs, but never had I felt their touch burn through me and reach ears, lips, eyelids, fingertips. Why aren't you dressed? What are you going to wear? An orange and gold I've worn only in Kashi. Doesn't take me long to dress. Oh, can't you wear red? I was disappointed. You painted your toenails, and so I thought you'd wear that red Murshidabadi silk you asked Mughlani to alter the other day. 2 reds, she was amused. Wouldn't that be a little too much? Anyway, orange is close enough to red. All right, then, at least wear these. I scooped up my fish-shaped earrings and gold bead bracelets and poured them into her palm. But why? They're so pretty. Don't you want to wear them yourself? No, you wear them. They're lucky. Also, the fish is our city's emblem, and this is your first public performance here. I had last worn them the day I first met her. All right, I'm somewhat nervous to tell the truth. I'd better go and get ready. As we descended the stairs to get into the palanquin, she smiled at me through the small crowd of girls. She had blackened, alternating teeth so that the white ones shone like stars on a moonless night. For the first time, I understood why they call us fairies, Pari. I leant back for a moment, hiding my face, but the others seemed unaffected, chattering and squealing.
Great. Okay, so should we launch into the Q&A section of this session? And just to remind our participants, if you have any questions, feel free to send them using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. So first, I just want to begin by saying that, this novel does indeed paint a very sort of rich picture of Nawabi Lucknow and the lives of courtesans and, several other characters at the time. One of the most striking things about the novel is all of the sexual freedom it puts on display. And it's sexual freedom that feels almost unimaginable now. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what was the nature of the sexual freedom during pre-colonial times, and why might we struggle to find it in today's day and age?
It varied and very widely, and it still varies very widely. I wouldn't say that it's unimaginable today. In fact, I think today is the time when it is once again for certain groups. And even when it was for certain groups, flourishing. So you find lots of people leading lots of single women, for example, who, so they aren't the wives anymore, but there are lots of single women living on their own, entertaining on their own, having friendships with men and women, relationships, and so on. So now, of course, it's a small section, but then this also is a small section. It's not everyone. It's not the wives and mothers at home. They were having another kind of relationships within the families and so on, but that also is still going on today. So what I would say is the difference may be not maybe more about how openly you could write about it. Now today it is being openly written about, but in the intervening, say, 150 years, there was a whole period when it had become unspeakable in India, when various types of relationships, including same-sex relationships, had become unspeakable, which they weren't before. Or say men's relationships with courtesans had become unspeakable in this intervening period of 100 to 150 years. So I would say that in pre-colonial, one can't generalize about all cultures, but in this particular pre-colonial culture, it was a brief moment of exceptional, perhaps exceptional freedom for certain groups and certain people. So for men of certain classes, maybe all men, of course, had more freedom than most women did, but a lot of men who are busy earning their livelihood and all might not have a lot of time and freedom, leisure. We're talking about a very educated, cultured class, and courtesans were sort of the female intellectuals of the time. So queens and princesses were educated and accomplished, could be, and courtesans were. And courtesans had a certain type of sexual freedom, and no freedom is absolute, of course. So the difference in between is that, of course, with the British Act, if this is pre-1857, Nafis is writing around the 1830s, and she's writing about a period in the late 90s. After, she doesn't know, of course, that 1857 is going to happen, but we know that. And 1857, post 1857, the British really took over the administration, and they cracked down and destroyed these cultures pretty much. They introduced their own education system, their own administrative system, the law in 1861, which banned so-called sodomy, the laws which banned courtesans and turned them either into sex workers or forced them to get married or sent them into poverty. They destroyed a number of institutions, basically. They destroyed the whole princely system of patronage, which made courtesans' lives possible, and they introduced Western modernity. So I would say there was an earlier type of modernity portrayed here. They introduced Western modernity, which has its own redeeming factors, because now today, for instance, we are in Western modernity, another kind of freedom does appear. But many things are also lost in that process. Maybe not entirely lost. I think they continue in various ways, maybe in cinema, in various other ways, dance and music and so on. But yes, a whole type of literature, like the poetry that I use in the book, kind of poetry that was very free and open and could write about many things, about religion very freely, about sex quite freely. That whole kind of poetry all goes into manuscripts, into libraries, which is where I mostly had to find it at the time. And it's no longer acceptable. The poets who wrote that are kind of removed from the canon to a large extent, not entirely. So I would say it's a kind of Victorian Puritanism that takes over the lives of the educated particularly. You know, the lives of the very poor may not change that much, but the lives of the educated, the public life. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, you speak about this unspeakability that emerges with this new kind of modernity that has arrived post the British, arrives with the British. I wonder if some of that unspeakability is also born of an increasing impulse to name and identify. Because I noticed that your book, for example, is not, the blurb doesn't say lesbian romance in 18th century Lucknow, right? It's same-sex romance or love in that context. And so I wonder whether there is a relationship between that unspeakability and the increasing forms of identification that are emerging.
There's a difference between names and identities. So yes, there aren't at the time such fixed identity categories as now we are using, though again they are dissolving to some extent, but using names like homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual. Yeah. There weren't any names like that. On the other hand, there weren't identity categories that were so fixed. On the other hand, there was naming, and that is the interesting part, particularly of this society, where there were words for same-sex sex. There were words for a woman's female, very close companion. Again, there was a fluidity to it. A woman's very close, intimate companion could be called dogana, hazanaki, haguiya, there were various words. Now, this could be a very close friendship. It need not be sexual. It could be sexual. It could be sort of romantic. It could, there's a whole fluid area there. It can shift, as I show in the book, it shifts over time, as relationships do shift over time. And so also with men, there were definitely terms for men who were more interested in men. But most men who were interested in men also did get married and have children, a side of life which doesn't appear in the book. And most courtesans or other women who were having relationships with women were also having relations with men, most of them. So it wasn't so clear cut in that way. At the same time, there was a notion that some people prefer one and some people prefer others, though anybody may do anything at any time. So that idea which you have in the Kama Sutra too, it's an old idea. I think is the way most societies functioned in the ancient world for sure, and in India before the complete takeover by the British. In the book, the British are present, but they haven't completely taken over the cultural and social life, though they are dominating the economic and political life. So,
Yeah. Let me bring in a question that was asked by an anonymous attendee, because it's perhaps best to address this at the outset. So the attendee asks, "Ma'am, what was your inspiration?"
Well, two things. One is that this world had sort of captured my imagination since I wrote the book Gender, Sex and the City about this, which is a scholarly book about Urdu poetry at that time. So that world was very alive in my head for about 5 years. I was doing all the research to read all the literature from the time, or much of the literature, not all the literature. So that world was alive in my head. And then this kind of love story, which could have been set in any period. I don't think love in its essence varies so much. It could have been set in any period, but was also in my head and imagination for many years. The two sort of came together, and it seemed to me I wanted to see how a love story would unfold in a society where it didn't have to battle the same kind of prejudices that we have to today, though there would be other kind of prejudices at the time and other difficulties at the time. For example, today we can easily travel between, not now anymore, but we could easily travel between one city and another, or even one country and another, which is not as easily possible at the time. Travel, I mean to actually move, to actually move your location, your residence. So I wanted to just see, but that won't solve all the, if there are no social prejudices, will it solve all the problems love faces? No, obviously not. And that's why love has been written about in all languages at all times. And so the two sort of came together in my head, the story, the main story, and then all the little stories and anecdotes that I knew from that world, which I've picked up from the poets' writings themselves, many, many stories. So it's just all.
Yeah. So, I mean, the sense I'm getting is that, you know, a lot of what you've put into this book is linked to some of your thought, obviously, prior to the writing of this book. And I was wondering, you know, what was the process of researching it like? Because I know you had to go to the library, and because all of these Urdu poets' works, which now fall within that realm of unspeakability, could only be found in those original manuscripts, right? If I'm not mistaken.
When I didn't do any research for this novel. The research was done for the earlier academic book, and that was done in the early 2000s when, yes, the work was not all, but mostly in manuscript form. And I went to libraries and did that. And I also read a lot of stuff that had been published. And now that work, interestingly, after mine and other people's work on that poetry, that work has come back into print in Urdu. Not all of it, but a lot of it has come back into print in Urdu. So the research had all been done. So it was all in my head. And yeah, and also, of course, I put in one or two anecdotes which are not from that world, like the story of the clothes and the neighbors copying the clothes that the people have. That was from my grandmother's childhood in Bareilly, so it's not an entirely different world. But the closeness of neighborhoods, the way people met each other all the time in mohallas and crossed roofs to meet each other, that was familiar in many towns.
Yeah. I wonder, I mean, so I have two related questions. Let me bring up the first one first. I wonder, you know, as somebody who is primarily known as a non-fiction writer, but is now writing this work of fiction, what is your relationship with historical fidelity, right? Because you say that, of course, you're trying to paint a very rich picture of that time, but equally, you know, there are elements from your own life and from these times. So A, you know, what is that relationship? And B, what was the experience of making that switch like from nonfiction to fiction?
See, I've written poetry for most of my life, and poetry, of course, is not published as much anymore. It's hard to get it published.
Yeah.
So there's this, and so I have a connection to non-academic writing,
Mm.
and yeah, the switch was very interesting. I didn't switch entirely because I was doing both at the same time, sort of.
Yeah.
But it awakens a different part of your consciousness, a different part of your imagination. It made me feel more vulnerable. It sort of
Yeah.
exposed myself, my emotions more than nonfiction than academic work does. But it was exciting and interesting. I was also feeling insecure because I didn't know if the quality of the writing was any good. Academic writing, I can tell, but this I can't tell, couldn't tell. And it took a lot, I would say a lot more work, because a lot of stuff that I had earlier, I threw out. I edited it. One edits any work, but I edited this more perhaps than I do academic writing. As far as historical fidelity is concerned, as you said, historical fidelity, there's no such thing as absolute historical fidelity. You're writing in your own moment, and your own moment is going to be present. But as far as possible, I mean, I made a whole timeline of all the events, the public events at the time, then a timeline of the women's story that I was making up, and tried to sort of put them together. And I'm sure I may have made mistakes, I don't know. But and many of the anecdotes, the relationships, and actually even the characters, like Insha, Rangi, Jurrat, were actual people, and so who are characters in the book. So I actually, there to a large extent, I drew on their writings, both their poetry and their prose writings, and also other people's writings from the time, and translated this.
Nice, yeah. So we're about half an hour in, so maybe we can bring in the second excerpt before we move on to more questions. And then after that, if our audience has more questions, obviously they should feel free to send them in.
Okay, so this is when Chapla and Nafis they've been having this sort of romantic friendship for a while, and now they are sort of what we would call having a relationship, or they're together. And so it's from that time. So summer was at its height, and she sat behind me on the cool floor, arms wrapped around me, hair streaming over me, as we sang Rangeen Saab's new ghazal, in which a girl sang to a girl, and which we had made our special song. Zanahi ki रंगत ए जवान और पीर सोने की, सरापा वो नजर आती है एक तस्वीर सोने की, किनारी गिर्द यूं चेहरे की उसकी जेब देती है, मुसव्वर जो कहती है तस्वीर की तहरीर सोने की, गले के हार तेरे हो रही हूं ए लग्गा मैं, नहीं दरकार तुझको जाने मन जंजीर सोने की. My dearest has a youthful complexion like yellow gold. From head to foot, she looks like a picture of gold. Her scarf's border frames and adorns her face, her words shaped like calligraphy on a picture of gold. I've become the necklace round your neck, dear one, so my life, you don't need a chain of gold. Now her many moods were all for me, when she picked a fight and went away to her room to sulk, leaving me in despair, only to send a contrite note over and follow it next day. When she sat working on her poems, puffing at the hookah, our verses answered, completed each other, played on each other's names, hidden codes we thought only we could decipher. Two nutshells concealing a joint kernel, twinned buds on one stem. Milk and saffron, color in every drop. Or when I started up from our bed, hearing footsteps, and ran into the dressing room with her purple veil draped across my chest, and she followed, murmuring, "It looks like a coal cellar on you. Take it off. What do you want with an orni anyway except to cover your head? A little thing like you." "I want to smell it," I teased, holding it over my face and then dropping it to the floor and her onto it. When we argued over mangoes, an argument one can be sure of hearing in every home every summer. "Kashi's mangoes are much sweeter," she said, eyes dancing at me over the green-skinned one she was devouring. "Like honey, golden, and not stringy at all." "They're too sweet," I said. "Ours have a dash of sourness to set off the sweet. Langras are rounder, they fit nicely into your hand." "You seem to be doing pretty well, fitting ours into your hand." "That's because I'm good at it. Watch." She picked up another and slowly began pressing a thumb and two fingers upwards from its base to its peak, her eyes transfixing mine. When she pinched off the end and began sucking, her wide mouth half smiling through the juices, I was thankful I'm not fair enough for a flush to be noticed.
I love the ending of that excerpt, and this actually leads me to my next question. So, I mean, I don't want to give away too much about the book, but as the blurb itself suggests, And there are difficulties in the love between Nafis and Chapla because, Chapla must return to where she came from. And the question that the blurb leaves us with is, will their love stand the test of distance? So I was wondering, how do you think about the role of, if not unrequited, then incomplete or unfinished love in both storytelling, but also in our lives?
Yeah, I think that's one of the great themes of literature. The other great theme is death, which is cross-cultural and I would say sort of universal from ancient times to the present, is the difficulties of love. It has often been said by many writers that one person loves more and the other one loves less. So even when it is requited, it's very rare that it's completely equal. And also this can change over time. Any love that is really love of any kind changes over time, and that's what the novel I try to show over the 30 years, that it remains, it doesn't die, but it changes its form. And some of the difficulties which persist are, as you said, location, which even today is a difficulty, but maybe less so. At the time, to actually uproot yourself individually from your community, your family, and to move individually to another city was very, very difficult. People moved in groups, but they didn't rarely moved, and especially for women. So that's one difficulty. The other is that when the book starts, Chapla is just visiting and she already has a girlfriend in Kashi, right? So that is why it takes so long for this attraction to sort of be consummated.
Yeah.
So there are those problems, right? And so there'll always be those kinds of problems.
Yeah. I see that somebody has sent in a question about same-sex relations more broadly, and maybe if you're open to that, we can take them after we're done discussing the book. So if people have more questions about other aspects of your writing, or questions that just deal with same-sex love broadly, we can take those as well, maybe closer to the end of the session.
Sure.
This next question is from Lasya. She asks, are there any interesting anecdotes from that time that you came across, which you didn't include in your book? Is there anything that you can share?
Didn't include. Okay, well, Insha wrote a book of jokes, for example, and these were jokes which the Nawab just, everybody jokes and makes up puns and things like that. So jokes that fell from the Nawab's lips, he was a court poet, and so he turned them into a book of jokes. I did mention it in the book, but I didn't go into detail about that. So that was an anecdote that I didn't use in the book. Other anecdotes I didn't use in the book from Insha's youth. There are lots of anecdotes from the poetry itself about what women do and things women do together. There's anecdotes from the male poet's youth in Delhi, and so many things like that.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, if you'd like to share, you can also share anecdotes that you did use in the book, because it will give our listeners a better idea of the book.
Okay, the one I shared was called about the story of Banka Begum, which is a very interesting one, where there are robberies going on in the city where men are thugs and robbers are stopping women and stealing their jewelry. And so there's this guy who's a banka, very fashionable, a dandy, a man about town. And dandy at that time means he also has a dagger and everything, most men carried those. And he so dressed himself up as a woman, hung his hand out of the palki with bangles on it. And then, so he looked like a woman. And when they tried to rob him, he jumped out and fought the whole group in an Amitabh Bachchan style and defeated them. So then the Nawab, not the Nawab, it was the Mughal emperor, called him to court to be rewarded and honored, and he went dressed as a woman. And then ever after, he continued to dress like a woman. So he's called Banka Begum. So he's called Begum, but Banka Begum, but everyone knows that he's a man dressed as a woman. And then he died fighting the troops of Nadir Shah. So you find this very interesting crossover where it's what we might sort of call transgender, but on the other hand, he's very much a military soldier and everything. I mean, he's just doing a range of things.
This leads nicely into my next question, which was about the forms of masculinity that we encounter in the book are quite different from the stereotypical forms of masculinity we see today. And sort of in a similar vein to my early questions, I was wondering, can that also be attributed to certain Victorian forms of morality and sexuality, or just what's going on there with that shift that we see between then and now.
Again, I would say that today, in fact, is a time when when masculinity is, there's a wide range, and perhaps there always was a wide range, but today it's more visible, with men once more wearing some men at least wearing brighter colors and jewelry and whatever. Yes, at the time I have written about this, that men, for instance, had a different relationship to color. And I'm talking again about educated men in the court, men in the city, not rural men, who continued to wear jewelry and so on. But that they wore jewelry, they wore cosmetics, they wore bright colors, and at whatever age, even older men. And it's after 1857 and that whole second half of the 19th century. By the 20th century, educated men have all switched A, to Western dress, and B, to dark and dull colors, right? So half the population basically loses its relationship to color, to jewelry, to cosmetics, to all that, which makes a huge difference. It's not a small thing, as I realize, say in the US, when you look at a campus and look at a campus in India, you'd see, just like I taught at Miranda House, you'd see all these bright colors, and here you look and it's mostly blue, white, black. It makes a huge difference to my state of being anyway. So that's one thing. The other thing is that masculinity at the time is very different, in the sense that if you are having relations with men, you're not necessarily seen, you're not seen as effeminate for that. In fact, most men carried daggers and were ready to fight at the drop of a hat. So it's just differently viewed and presented. Particularly in the case of courtesans, their friendships with men is what I'm very interested in, because in most societies, a female-male friendship is very often tends to be viewed as sexual or romantic, even if whether it is or it isn't. But courtesans were among the few women who could have friendships with men that could go through this whole fluid spectrum, could be maybe love at one time, sexual at one time, become a friendship later, or could always have been a friendship. The quota was a place men went to have conversations about literature, about life, about sexuality, about everything, which they couldn't talk as freely with women at home, maybe. Right? But they could talk with other men, of course. But courtesans were the women with whom they could talk so freely. And so, yeah, but I would, that's...
And that, that leads me into the question about, the kind of respect and the status that was granted to courtesans at that time. If you could tell us a little bit about what that was, and just set the scene, I guess, in that regard.
Yeah, I guess from Bombay cinema in the 20th century, there comes to be this misconception that the wife is the same as a sex worker. And that is not the case at the time. The wives, especially sort of upper class the wives, they were not sex workers, in the sense that they didn't sleep for cash with anyone who came along. They had long-term relations with one man at a time. So what we would now call serial monogamy, sort of. And they could break off these relations. These were not marriages. But also a lot of the wives did get married, as I show in the book, at a certain point, and they decide to, and sometimes you see this in Bombay movies, they decide to retire or whatever, and they get married. But not everybody did. Courtesans lived in matrilineal households where a daughter was more welcome than a son, where skills and property, money was passed on from mothers to daughters, aunts to nieces. And when I say mother and daughter, aunt and niece, it's not necessarily biological, it could be adopted. These are the kinship terms used between them. And where the men in the family are much less important, much less property, they live downstairs, and so on. So they were very famous. They were sort of glamour girls and the stars of the city before film stars took that role, right? Their names are known. You can see this from the male poets' writing. They write elegies for them, for someone who dies, or the wife who dies. They write poems describing them from head to foot and praising them very highly as extremely beautiful, extremely intelligent, and extremely well-dressed, and all of this by name. So this is not only in Lucknow, it's also in Agra and in other cities. So in Banaras as well. So they were highly educated, highly accomplished. They are the ones who, this is well known, passed on classical music and dance and worked on it and changed it, transformed it. And these skills were highly appreciated. Also, this is a brief moment in Lucknow history where, because the British perhaps had taken over economic and political power, the Nawabs had social and cultural capital is what they were left with, right? They could develop social and cultural elements of life. And this is a time when the court is when women are much more present and powerful in court than at many other times and places. It's a rare moment. And for example, the court at a certain point employed hundreds and hundreds of women in various capacities as pan servers, as dancers, as theater people, as singers, etc., and paid them very substantial salaries. The wives were among the few women who owned property in their own names as single women, not as wives or daughters. And they also were in the highest tax bracket in Lucknow in the mid 19th century,
Oh,
paying
wow.
income tax. Right. So yeah, it's about money and the power, and money and property really, and the power that owning that in your own names, and therefore the kind of relative, it's not absolute, but the relative freedom and the relative power that you have to make choices.
Yeah.
And that is still controlled by your family and your mother and the older women in the family and all of that. That's still there, but it's different from from women in a conventional family. So.
Right. This next question is from Shanya, and it relates to the question I asked previously about masculinity. She asks, do you think visual masculinity changed when the switch to Western attire happened? What you said about the clothes and what those denoted is extremely interesting, and I want to know more about the connection between visual representation of masculinity, and how does that play out now?
Yeah, I wouldn't just call it visual representation. I would call it the body's relationship to your daily life. Like every day when you dress in the morning, your relationship to cosmetics, to jewelry, to color, to clothes, that makes a huge difference to one's life. That's one of the things one does every single day, right? So for instance, I think that clothing develops in a culture, in a society over time. It evolves to suit that society's body, physical body, and the geographical situation, right? So the kind of black three-piece suits and buttoned-up shirts and ties, etc., which evolve in the West. It is to do with the climate being different, and in most of the West and most of India, and it's a Northern European style. It also suits a certain kind of body, and this is my own opinion, but I don't think most Indian men look better in Western dress, in the kind of bush shirts and terraline shirts and tight and pants that evolved by the 20th century. I think they look much better in dhoti, in kurta pajama, which has evolved to suit the Indian body. And of course, one can't generalize about all Indian bodies. There are always exceptions and who look great in jeans and all that. But I would say overall, talking about them. And also, so women don't change their dress until now. It is beginning to change in the upper class. But women mostly, and even now among women, there's much more switching. There's much more switching between being able to wear a sari, a kurta, a dress, jeans, etc. They can wear all with equal ease. Whereas men in the public world, even today, don't wear Indian dress to work, right? They can't wear Indian dress to work. They can wear it to weddings and at home, but not, they don't usually wear it in an executive position or something. Whereas Indian women now are switching, I noticed, to black suits and things like that, but still are able to wear Indian dress as well. So yes, I think it makes a difference to your relationship to your body, to your culture, and to other people, to what you see. When you look out and you see a sea of black and blue, or you see a sea of color, it makes a difference to your state of mind, your state of being, and to your sense of yourself in the world. And same with jewelry, for example. And all the men at this time wore some jewelry. They wore earrings, they wore necklaces, they wore all of this. And that goes away for a class of men, for educated urban men. So,
yeah. So we have a couple more questions to go. If people have any more questions that they're holding on to, please do send them in within the next couple of minutes so that we can make sure to address them during our session. This next question is from Priyadarshini. They say some problems that are very inherent to lesbian love stories in spaces that are occupied by Chapla and Nafis. Do these women have trouble finding a label to name their relationship? Considering there's the distance, the otherness of their romance in a heteronormative world and so on, which gives them a lot of liberty on personal fronts, but imposes so many restrictions on the public front. So that's the question.
You see, one reason why I studied the society is precisely because there were words that were publicly known and were used. For instance, the word chapti, chapat or chapti nama. So poets wrote poems called chapti nama, which were about what we would call lesbian relationships. And chapti was the word for sex between women, and it was very specific. It was not about friendship. Chapna, chipit, chipatna, to stick to each other, right? Clinging. So So chapat baz was chapat baz means one who indulges in chapti. So like you have kabutar baz and patang baz. People are playing different kinds of things that they're interested in. So you have Londe baz, a man who's interested in men, young men, and chapat baz, which is a woman who's interested in other women. This was widely used at the time. The word is still continues to be used right up to the 1970s. It has been found. It's found in Hindi writing, Hindi and Urdu writing. So it's a word. The word is there. So yes, they're not putting themselves in identity categories to the same extent. They're not using, but they are using words like chapat baz, which is a sort of a category. It's sort of saying a woman who is interested in chapti. Okay, so and they're definitely words, and not only words but rituals for establishing female couples, which I mentioned in the book. But there were many more rituals than I mentioned, where if two women form a couple, where they share a certain food item, and they exchange exchange clothing items, and then they are seen as a couple among their friends, especially their female friends. And this was done. And the words like doganas and nakis. Naki is a fairly specific word about two women who were exchanged, eaten parts of of what we call a wishing bone of a bird. Right, and ilaichi, which is exchanging cardamom. And there is a description by the poet Rangin, which I have referred to, where they eat the parts of the ilaichi, the bits of the cardamom, and they become each other's ilaichi. And he actually uses the word shadi for it. He says that they are married to each other, married among their female companions, he says, which suggests they may be married to a man otherwise, but in the female world, they are seen as married to each other. They form a couple. So no, I would say it was fairly public and fairly well known, not only among courtesans, but even among domestic women within the household. So within the household, meaning the larger household, the servants, the neighbors, etc., not just the immediate family, which is today. So I would say it's different in that respect from maybe many other societies before and after.
Yeah, just picking up on something you just said. So, I mean, clearly there are some of these very specific names or labels for very specific relationships that you find at the time. And I wonder if that poses any issues for translation. Because I know, I mean, you worked as a translator and you sort of translated a lot of that Urdu poetry. So how do you negotiate that?
Yes, it is very difficult, because I just use the word dogana as dogana. Dogana literally means the two parts. When you sometimes have a double fruit, you must have seen where two orange flakes are joined together. They are two, but they are one. That's the literal meaning of dogana, which means a double fruit. But that's the meaning in the dictionary. But then it comes to mean two women who are joined to, not men, two women who are joined together like that they are both two and one. And that is also in the dictionaries of the time. So these words are in dictionaries. These are not a secret code at all. They're in dictionaries. So yes, it was a question. In one earlier translation, I had used the words like dearest or girlfriend or my other half, my other self, but it becomes awkward. So then in this book, I've just used dogana, and I haven't explained it. The meaning kind of becomes obvious. So I've left it to the reader to figure out. In my academic work, I explain it at length. In a novel, you can't explain things like that. And then other times I have used words like girlfriend. And beloved is a little bit archaic, so many people translate words as beloved, but that's non-gender specific. So I haven't used that. Mostly I haven't used that. So yeah.
So all of our remaining questions now are about same-sex love more generally. So maybe let's move on to discussing those. So this question came from Sam a little while ago, and they say this question is about Pune 2019, not the 18th century, but it is about same-sex relations. I was supporting a lesbian activist in events, etc. She was originally from Lucknow, coincidentally. So I assume they're both from Lucknow or something of the sort. But she was very paranoid about the male, gay-dominated Pune LGBT scene. They're trying to get me out of business is sort of the thinking there. Unfortunately, that's what eventually happened, I think. So the question, I think, is about the idea that, the LGBT scene in India is dominated by gay men and some of the paranoia about that. So how would somebody navigate something like that?
I think that is largely to do, that's just my own opinion, I could be entirely wrong, but I think that's largely to do with the fact that men in general are more able to live and be in the public space, just regardless of their family's opinions. Not that it's easy. I mean, it does require a lot of conflict with the family and so, but men do live on their own, etc., and also spend a lot of time in the public space. Women do as well. Some women do, but less so. And most women seem to, it matters a lot more what the family thinks, and that struggle is, you can get over it, but it takes a lot more time and energy and so on. So that's one primary reason. And as we know, men are more likely, even in a classroom, if you have 2 men and 20 women, the 2 men are going to not be silent, they're going to talk. But if you have 10 men and 10 women, the men are going to talk more. I mean, I've noticed this in India as well as in America. It's everywhere, it's the same. So in the public space, most men, again, there are always exceptions, but most men are more articulate than most women. And yet there are lesbians who are quite visible in the movement. Take Shobhana Kumar of Queer Inc. She's running that, she's founded that, she's running that, and she interacts with the other elements, parts of the movement too, but she retains that space. So maybe like building your own space and retaining it is the way to do it. It's not easy, it's very difficult, but yeah, it's certainly possible. But and a lot of times when media asks women, lesbians, they always try to seek out lesbians to come and speak on TV, for example. They can find much more easily men to come and speak than women don't want to. Many of them want their faces to be covered, and even today, very few relatively women. So that is something that it has to change. It changes over time as the social conditions change, but it's surprising how many upper class, very educated, upper middle class parents are really hostile to the idea of their daughter being a lesbian, and then that daughter is unwilling to sort of completely cut off the family, because you lose a lot in doing that. An otherwise loving family, right? So that's true for both men and women, but I think it's more difficult for women.
This next question is from Ronica. They say, in case of gay marriages, there are intra-group differences of opinion with regard to the legalization of gay marriages. So some are looking for that legalization, and some vilify gay marriages as a demonstration of sort of a patriarchy, scripted binary, she says. So are gay marriages moving towards homonormativity is the question.
I don't use words like that, but I've written a book called Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriage in India. It was published first in 2005, updated version is appearing from Penguin now this year, in which I looked at basically, I got the idea by collecting reports from 1980 onwards of these young female couples who got married or who committed joint suicide together. And there are hundreds of them, right? So, and they were from all over the country. And the most interesting thing about them is that they were non-English speaking. They were mostly lower income groups, really lower income groups, a lot of them rural and small town, and most of them had no contact with any movement whatsoever. They had never heard any word like gay, lesbian, feminist, anything. They had no contact with any movement. On their own, they decided to get married, or they decided to commit joint suicide, or attempt it, or to do both, to get first marry and then commit joint suicide. So it was for years, I wondered what this meant. Like, where did they get this language of marriage and of death? This is before the international movement for gay marriage, right? They not got it from there. And that's why I wrote the book, was I researched where does this idea of a disapproved marriage and a joint suicide come from? And I found it in ancient texts, in 11th century Sanskrit texts. And then I found it in this Urdu poetry in the 18th century, the idea of a marriage. So clearly the idea of coupling and marrying is a very widespread and strong phenomenon. Whether we like it or not, it just is. It's kind of worldwide. The other idea of committing joint suicide, though, is something particularly Indian to that, because you find gay people committing suicide at a higher rate in the West, but joint suicide, no. Joint suicide may be an Asian phenomenon. It's found in Japan. It's in India. This idea that if we can't marry in this life, we will marry in the next life, and it may be connected to the idea of rebirth too, because many of the suicide notes left by these women, there are a few men too, but most of them are female couple, is this thing that if we can't be married in this life, we'll be married in the next life, and bury us together or burn us together or whatever. They ask for that. Sometimes the families do it, sometimes they don't. But so what I'm saying is that desire doesn't come from the leadership, whether it's homonormative or heteronormative, whatever it is. The desire comes from people. And that's true in the West too. The idea of demanding gay marriage did not come from the leadership of the gay movement. In the 1970s, two men went and filed for marriage rights. They managed to get married because one of them had a female sounding name. So it comes from people's desire. Now, you may not approve of that desire, but it comes from people's desire. And it doesn't come from the top. The pressure comes from below, is what I would say. And as far as being normative or not normative is concerned, I think an institution, any institution, changes a lot over time. So take the university. The university, as we now have it, the model of the university now have, comes from the monastery, right? It's a monastic institution. Oxford and Cambridge, they all started as monastic institutions. Words like professor, it means one who professes the Christian faith, right? You had to be a Christian to be a professor, right? Up to the 19th century, if you were a Jew or a Catholic, you could not be a professor. So we still use those terms. The university has changed a lot. We don't say we're not going to enter the university because it's a patriarchal institution, because if you won't enter any institution that's patriarchal, you'll have to go live on a desert island, right? So marriage is no different in that respect. Marriage has changed a lot over time in terms of property rights, custody, everything, and huge struggles have been fought to change it. So this is just another in a long series of changes. So marriage today is in, say, Delhi is very different from, say, marriage in Sweden today. And it's also very different from marriage in 5th century, wherever, Iran or 18th century Lucknow. It's very different. It's changing all the time. So it's not, I don't see it as a purely heterosexual. In fact, in my book, I've argued that in the West and in India too, the idea of close and inseparable friendship that is like a marriage, friendship being like marriage and marriage being a form of friendship, is a very, very old idea. And so one could equally well argue that heterosexual marriage is modeled on the great and famous models of inseparable friends. In the West, it's inseparable male friends, mostly inseparable male friends, but friends who live together, die together. You see it in Hindi movies. Yeah? We live together, we die together, we eat together. It doesn't matter if they're having sex or not, but that is the main, think of Sholay, that is the main relationship. So I would say that becomes a model for marriage. So I wouldn't say that the ideas of marriage come only from heterosexuality. No, not at all. They come from many sources.
Right. So this next question is from Zoya. They ask, what is your message for upcoming queer writers with respect to fictional writing? How do they overcome the anxiety linked to the revelation of their gender or sexual identity, as they also turn into authors for all the people who are going to read their work?
I have no message. That is an entirely, to a very large extent, a personal, individual evolution, growth, and struggle. It's very difficult for anyone, however upper class you are, however difficult to come out as we know, to come out as being as being engaged in same-sex love and using whatever category or not using whatever category is very, very difficult for anyone, and that is it can't be forced. It has to develop at its own individual pace and as you feel comfortable, and it's going to be somewhat different for everyone as well. So the only thing I would say is that mostly with Indian families, there are always exceptions, but mostly with Indian families, I have seen they come around. They are not happy. They would still prefer if a woman was married to a man and so-called heterosexually monogamous, not that everybody who seems heterosexually monogamous really is, but they would prefer that model. But over time, they come to accept it. And I've seen many families, greater or lesser degree of acceptance, they do come to accept it in one way or another, especially if they see that their child is happy. What I've seen is that if they can see that this being in this way is making their child miserable or is connected, or their child seems miserable, then they're going to be unhappy. If they see over time that their child is really happy, I think most parents are invested in their children's happiness, and it will take time, but they will accept it. The other thing is that if you yourself, and again, this can't be forced, but if you yourself seem confident, fearless, and happy, the world around you accepts it. And if you project yourself as a victim, to some extent that makes a difference, and people feel, oh yes, see, she's unhappy, she or he's unhappy. And now, of course, you may be feeling unhappy, and so you would have to show that unhappiness. You can't pretend. But when you get to that point of confidence, I think that does make a difference, not just to parents and family, to everyone, to people who just very ordinary people, neighbors, friends, people who work for you, etc. I've seen that happening, and yeah, that's what I would say.
Right. So this seems to be our last question. I'm not totally sure what it's referring to. I can take a stab, but an anonymous attendee has asked, would love to hear your thoughts about second love. I assume they mean the phenomenon of love a second time.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the novel. I do write about that in the novel, and yes, there are different types of love, and this whole idea, the Romeo and Juliet, once forever, and this is the only person possible. I think that's entirely unrealistic, as we know from reading fiction forever and from viewing life. It's very, very rare. It does happen that you find a first love and that's your only love and you stay with them for life, but it's very rare. Tolstoy says it's as rare as if you loaded up a whole packet with peas and then threw out all those peas and then you expect those two peas which you have marked before to fall next to each other. It's as rare as that. So even Plato, who talks about finding your other half and your other self, he does say if you can't find that other half or other self, that Mr. or Miss Right, then you should settle for a second best. You should find whoever else you can and have that life together, right? So yes, absolutely. I don't think that first love is the only love or necessarily the best love. And as you see in the novelist looking back at it, she realizes that it may not have been, but it does. There is something about the intensity of a particular love. It may not be the first. It may be the first or second or third love. It isn't her first love in this novel, but there is an intensity to it which is special and which persists, which is not dependent on time. It may be very brief, but there is that intensity. And yet at the same time, you can't live with life if the two people live together. That intensity is bound to dissipate. You can't live in an intense state for 50 years, right? You can only do that for 2 months or 2 years or 5 years, right? So there are other things, there are other aspects of love that are equally and more important over time. And yeah.
Great. Okay, so that was our last question, and I think that's a good note to end on. But I just want to thank you, Ruth, and thank everybody who joined us today. Do you have any parting comments you'd like to say before we close up?
No, nothing except read the book and leave comments on Amazon if you feel like it.
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, I think reviews are so important to keep writers, writing. So thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everyone who's joined us. And hopefully we'll see you all soon. Have a good night. Or in your case, day. Take care. Bye.
Bye.